Hello guys, and welcome back to another React video. In this video I'll be attempting to create a Connect 4 game using ReactJs. So the easy part is just going to be creating the board, so like displaying these tiles and stuff, and columns and rows. But the hard part is the algorithm to check if the person won or not, especially the diagonal part. So let's get right into it. So before I begin, I just want to point out that this isn't really a React tutorial. I expect you to know the basics of React, so I won't be going in depth on how everything works in React. I will be mainly focusing on the algorithm to check if the person has won or not in Connect 4. So let's get started.
Okay, so let's get started. So first thing I want to do is create the React app. So let's go ahead and do that. So open up command prompt and cd into the place where you want to create the project. So for me it's going to be documents, and npx create React app, and then the name of your app, so it's going to be Connect 4. And I'm going to be doing this with TypeScript, so let's get that set up for us. Template TypeScript, and then click enter. This should create the project for you. Okay, so as you can see, the project has been created, and now we want to cd into it, so cd Connect 4, and then code space dot to open it up in VS Code. Okay, so this is our project. Let's go ahead and run this. So npm start. Yes. And there you go, we have a basic React project. So basically this is all being run in app.tsx. So let's go ahead and remove all this code. We don't really need it. And let's also remove some files. So I'm not going to be doing any testing, so I'm going to remove this. And logo.svg, I don't really need that as well. So let's delete that. And also in app.tsx, we're actually importing the logo. So this should give us an error, so let's just remove that line of code. Save that and let's check everything. Okay, we are good. So now we can get started on the project. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is go to app.css, and I'm going to remove all of this and replace it with some CSS that I have written. So this is just going to be the design of our Connect 4 board. So I don't want to bore you with all this CSS, so you can just copy paste it. I have a link in the description to the GitHub repository of this project. So you can just clone the project if you want as well. Or you can just, if you want to do it step by step, then you can just copy the CSS code and paste it in. Okay, so now we're going to make a components folder inside source. And the first component we are going to have is the actual board. So I'm going to call it gameboard.tsx. And RFC to make a React functional component. I'm going to make this into a arrow function actually. So const gameboard is equal to an arrow function, and since we're going to be doing typing, this is going to be a React functional component. And we have an error here. React has not exported member. Functional component of fn. Okay, and this is going to be returning a JSX element. So JSX.element. Okay, great. So now we want to design this game board. Okay, so just for starters, I'm going to have a button over here in this game board component. So just have a button, and it's going to say new game. So we're going to use this button to reset the board each time you click on it. And I'm going to give it a class name of button. So this is included in the app.css file, this class, which is being imported actually in app.tsx over here. Now we want to import gameboard over here. So import gameboard. Gameboard. I couldn't do any automatic imports, so I'm going to import it manually. Gameboard from /components/gameboard. I'm actually going to do this as an absolute path. We have an error over here. Oh, that's because we aren't actually exporting it over here. Yeah, export default gameboard. Yep, the error is gone. Great. So now over here we should have a button. There we go. Right here. Also, I'm going to have a h1 over here that says Connect 4. h1 connect 4. Save that. Great. So okay, so now I'm going to change this to an absolute path. So how do we do this? We need to go to tsconfig.json, and in compiler options we are going to have a base URL, which is just going to be dot. So from connect 4 basically we're going to start off. So over here, if I go to app.tsx, I should be able to do source/components. Yeah, great, it works. So basically starting off from connect 4, that's why we said dot. So if I say, for example, dot/source, then over here I can just say, see, we have an error. It should be components/gameboard, because we're starting off from source. But I'm going to set this to actually just dot. So we start off from connect 4. And we have an error again, so I need to change this to source/components. Great. So now let's go to gameboard and actually create this board. So I'm going to have a state for the board. So const board set board. I'll be using the useState hook, equal to useState, and we're going to set it automatically to a variable called initial board. So let's go ahead and create that variable. Also going to be a constant, so const initial board is equal to. So basically how I'm going to do this, how I'm going to set up the initial board, it's going to be an object which has a rows property, which is going to be an array of objects, which are basically, each object is going to be a row, and then that object has a columns property, which is going to be an array of objects, and then each object is going to be a column which has a property called player, and that player is going to be 1 or 2, so player 1 or player 2. I know this might be kind of confusing right now, but it will make sense as we go. And the reason why I just didn't make it an array of arrays is just so I can type it out. So I need to make this into an object so I can type it out. Okay, so this is going to be an object which has a rows property, and then the rows is going to be an array, like I said. And so let's go ahead and do that. So array dot from, and then from length. So I'm going to have a constants over here, components, constants folder, and we'll have a index file, so index.tsx, ts actually, not tsx, because we're not going to be returning any JSX component here. So yeah, so const connect 4 rows, so here's how many rows we're going to have, which is going to be, I believe, 6 rows. And we're also going to have const connect 4 columns, which is going to be 7 rows, 7 columns, sorry. And then we need to export these actually, so export and export this, and type of this is going to be a number, not going to change. This is also going to be a number. So let's go back to game board, and the length of this is obviously going to be C4 rows. So this is basically going to make us an array that is basically, the length of that array is C4 rows, which is, as you can see over here, 6. So I'm going to make this as an absolute path, so source/components/constants. Okay, and so each element in that array is going to be filled with an object. So each row is going to be an object. So we're going to do an arrow function, which gives us the index, and then we will return an object which has a columns property, like I said, and that columns property is also going to be an array, and the length of that array is going to be the C4 columns constant that we created. So length is C4 columns, which is 7, I believe. Yeah, so 7. And we need to actually import this. So let's copy that, import it from here. And also each element in that array, in the columns array, we are going to have an object. So we will be also returning an object, which is basically an object with the player property, and we're going to set that to null. So it's still not filled with a player, that specific column. And yeah, that should be it for the initial board. So let's copy that and put this in useState. Okay, so now I'm going to console.log this initial board so you can actually see the object. So cfg initial board, save that, and we'll go to connect 4. Yeah, okay. So we have an object, which is the board, and the board has a rows property. The object has a rows property, which is an array of objects, and each element in this array is a row. And as you can see, we have 6 elements, so 6 rows, because that's how many rows we have in Connect 4. And each row is an object which has a columns property, and the columns is an array of columns. And as you can see, we have 7 columns. So each element in this array, in the columns array, represents a column. And we have 7 columns in Connect 4, so we have 7 over here. And each column is an object with a player property, which is set to null for now. And then when that column is filled, then it would be set to player 1 or 2 based on which player filled it. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. And now let's go back to coding. So now we want to make a board interface to type out this constant, this, and the state as well. So let's make an interfaces folder in components, interfaces, and then we will have a file called board.ts, and we will export an interface called board, which is an object with a rows property. And this rows property is going to be an array of rows, so we will need another interface called row. So let's go ahead and create that. So row.ts, and this will export an interface called row, which is an object with a columns property, which is also an array of columns. So now we need a column interface. So let's go ahead and make that column.ts, and we will export an interface called column, and this is an object with a player property, which is either going to be a number or it will be null. So it's either going to be a player, so if it's filled it's going to be a number, player 1, player 2, and if it's not filled, so if it's an empty, then it's going to be null. And now we need to actually fill these. So columns is going to be an array of columns, so let's import that column interface we just created, and yeah, it's going to be an array of that. And let's change this to absolute paths, so source/components/interfaces. So the reason I'm using absolute paths is it's much better because, for example, if we migrate this file to, for example, from interfaces to just components, as an example, and this should not give us an error because the absolute path isn't going to change. It's always going to be source/components/interfaces/column. But for example, if I do dot/column, then it will change because we change the directory of this row, so it would also have to change the path over here. So yeah, now we need to go to board, and the rows is going to be an array of row, so we need to do that, and then source/components/interfaces/row. Now we go to game board, and let's type this out. So this is going to be a board, and let's automatically import that. And this is going to be an absolute path as well, so source/components/interfaces/board. Also, this state, the board state, this is also going to be a board, so board, and yeah, so we should be good now. So now what we want to do is actually let's actually display the board. So let's make a new component over here. Sorry, components. We will call this a game row.tsx, and we'll do RFC, React Functional Component. So I'm also going to change this into a arrow function. So const game row is equal to an arrow function, and this is also a React Functional Component, and it also returns a JSX element. So JSX dot, sorry, not JS, JSX dot element code on here, and we need to export this component so we don't get an error like last time. Game row, save that, and let's go back to game board and import this. So actually first we are going to be mapping over the rows of the initial board, or the board and state. So we're going to do board dot rows dot map, and then and this arrow function would give us an index, which is going to be a number, and a row, which is going to be type row. So yeah, and then what this arrow function does, it actually returns some JSX. So we'll be returning an JSX element, which is game row. So game row, let's import that. And the key of this is going to be the index. So we'll just give it a key index. And we're also going to give it another prop, which is row. So we're going to be giving it the row it is. So row. And so again, an error because it's not expecting any props right now. We'll do that in a second. First, I want to change this to an absolute path. So source slash components slash game row. Yeah. Okay. And yeah, so before I do anything, I just want to put this into a table, and then a t body, table body, and then I'll paste that in there. So also I need to put this index actually after the row. So we need to copy this, and we'll put a comma after row, and paste that in there. Another thing is this will be returning a JSX element, so JSX.element. And also this row hasn't been imported, the interface, so I need to go ahead and do that. And now the only error left is the prop over here. So just go to game row and let's receive this prop. So we can receive it as props and then do props.row, or we can just do object destructuring over here. So that's what I'm going to do. It's much easier. So we're going to be receiving a row, and let's type that out actually. So row is declared but values never read. That's not really an issue. So I'm going to make a new interface. I'll call this props. So I'm just going to do this in here. I'm not going to do that in the interfaces folder. So interface props is an object with just a row inside it, which is type row. And source slash components slash interfaces slash row. Also, we have an error here. So over here, we also need to say that it will be receiving this props interface. Okay, great. So it should be good. We have an error. Oh, we put a dot here. It's meant to be a comma. So let's go back, fix that. There we go. Oh, this is actually the wrong path for row. Sorry about that. Let's actually do some automatic imports over here, and then we'll fix that up. So source slash components slash interfaces slash row. Okay, so now it should be good. Yeah, we should be good. So now let's go to game row, and let's actually change this to a table row, so tr, because this is going to be a table. So each row is going to be a table row, and what we're going to do here is actually be returning a we're going to map over the columns of this row. So row.columns.map. And we will be receiving the column itself. So column, which is going to be type column. Let's fix this up, or if we get like last time. Components. Okay. And also the index, we're going to need that. Number, sorry, index number, not number index. And this is not a dot, this is a comma. Okay, and then this is going to be an arrow function, which returns also JSX element. Let's go ahead and do that. JSX element, and we'll be returning a new component that we'll be creating, which is going to be called a tile, because we're going to have a tile or a column. Actually, we'll call it game column, I guess. It makes more sense. So game column.tsx, and then React functional component. Let's change this to an arrow function. Const game column equal to arrow function, and this is going to be a React functional component, and we'll be returning a JSX element. Okay, great. So now let's import the. Oh, we need to export it before we import it. Export default game column. Okay, yeah, so now let's import it. So we're going to be returning a game column, and we'll change that to an absolute path. Source/components, yeah, /game column. And so what we're going to be giving it is a key. That's the first thing. So key is going to be the index, and we can't actually receive the key for some reason in the game column component, and we're going to need the index of this column. So I'm going to pass in a prop called column index, which is equal to the index, and yeah, I think that should be it. We have an error because we're not expecting this prop over there, so let's go ahead and do that. So also I'm going to do object destructuring, column index, and we're going to make a new interface called props. Over here we're going to be putting props as well, and let's make this interface now. So interface props, an object with a column index in it, and it's just going to be a number. So let's save that. Great. Also, we're going to need the column itself, so we can see if the column is filled with the player or if it's empty or what. So we can change the color of the column based on the player. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to receive a column over here as well. Column, which is type column, obviously, and this is going to be source/components /interfaces/column. And then over here we need to also pass this in, so column is equal to column. Great, so now let's go to game column.tsx, and this is going to be a TD, which I believe stands for table data. I'm not sure though. So yeah, yeah, and then we're gonna have a div with the class name tile, because that's what it is, and you can find this class inside app.css. Just the class that is in there for styling, and inside the div we're going to have another div, and the class name of this div is going to be we're going to have a tile status variable, but first it's just going to be circle, and also we're going to have a variable as well. So let's go ahead and create this variable actually. So first is going to be the tile status is going to be open, which means that this tile isn't filled with a player. And then we're going to check if the column.player is equal to 1, then tile status is equal to player 1, and then else if, sorry, else, not SLA, and not LE, else if column.player is equal to 2, then the tile status is equal to player 2. So we didn't just do else because it could be null as well, and that would be an issue if it's null and we put it as player 2. So yeah, okay, so the class name is going to be circle. This is just for styling purposes. So we have a player 1 class and a player 2 class, and we have an open class as well in app.css. There's the open, and we have player 1, player 2. So it's just going to change the background color and stuff. So that's why we're doing this tile status. So yeah, now we need to add this tile status to the class name of this div. So I'm actually going to do this, and I'll add the tile status to the string. So let's save that, and now I think our board should be set up. Very cool. So yeah, clearly we have an issue with the styling, and I figured it out. This does not work. I can't do it like this. We have to do it as an array, and we'll add tile status, and then the circle string, and then we have to do join it with an empty string. Save that, and there we go. So now we have our board. So yeah, now we want to be updating the board. So for example, if I click over here, then I want to update this tile or this column with the player color. So if it's player 1, it would be red, I think, and if it's player 2, it would be yellow. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. We're going to need a update board function over here. So now we're going to have to pass this down to game row, and from there we'll pass it down to game column, and yeah. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and create this function. So const update board. This is going to be an arrow function, and this function returns nothing, so void. And also we are going to be receiving a column index. Column index, which is going to be a number. So save that. So basically how I'm going to update this board is, let's go to the board. So for example, let's say the person clicks over here. So I'll take the index of this column, so any of these columns, so it's going to be the same index always. And so this one is going to be index 2, because we start from 0, so 0, 1, 2. And then I'll start off from the bottom, so the first row, and I'll check the column index in each row, starting from the first one. If it's null, if the player of that column is null, then we'll set it to the current player. Otherwise, we'll go on the next row and then the next row. So it's basically going to be a for loop until we find the empty column. So until we find the empty column. I hope this makes sense, and if it doesn't, it should make sense after we code it. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually get a copy of the board. So I'll make a new variable called board copy, and it's going to be type board, and it's going to be equal to the board in the state. And then we're going to do a for loop over this board, and we're going to loop over the rows inside this board. So for let I, which is a number, is equal to, I'm going to set it to 5. So because let me go to the board so I can explain this. The rows actually start off from the top, so I'm going to start off from 5. So index 5 is going to be the one at the bottom, because we want to start from the bottom and go up. So I hope that makes sense. So I is equal to 5, and then as long as I is bigger than or equal to 0, we'll keep going. And then I minus minus. Sorry, minus minus. Okay. Now what we want to do is we will get the player of the column in this row, in the current row. So let column player is equal to board copy dot rows, and then we'll get the row that has this index. So rows index dot columns. So now I want to get the columns of this row, and then we'll get the specific column using the column index, and then we'll get the player of that column. And column player is either going to be a number or it's going to be null. So just like what we have inside interfaces in column, the player is either going to be a number or null, so it's going to be the same thing. And let's go back to game board. Okay, and now we want to check if the column player is null. So if not column player, that will check if it's null or not. So if not column player, that means the column, the player of this column is null, so that means it hasn't been played yet. So now we want to fit it with this current player. So we actually need a current player state, so we can switch the player each time. So let's go and do that. Const current player set current player, and if we put to use state, we're going to initially set it to 1, and this is just going to be a number. So yeah, so now if the column player of this column is null, then we want to set it to the current player. So let's go ahead and do that. So board copy dot rows I dot columns column index dot player is equal to current player, and then we will just break, because we are done with this for loop, because we already found the column that we would like to update. So there's no point continuing this for loop, and that will just make some errors for us, because then the other columns are going to be updated if they're null, which they would be. So yeah, so now what we need to do is actually update the board in state. So we'll do set board copy, and yeah, okay. So we can't actually test this out right now because it's not linked to anything. We need to actually link it to the game row, and then from there we'll link it to the game column. So let's do that. So we'll pass in a new prop called update board, and this is equal to update board. And we have an error because it's not expecting it as a prop, so let's go ahead and do that. So update board, the type of it is just going to be an arrow function, and it receives a column index, which is a number, and it returns nothing, so void. And we need to do it over here as well. Let's receive it here, update board, and we'll pass that on to the game column. So let's do that. Update board is equal to update board, and we'll also have an error because we're not expecting it as a prop. So we need to do that here too. We want to be like that, and there, and then update board. Update board is a arrow function, receives column index, which is a number, and then it returns nothing, so void. And we have an error here, game row. Leave that for later. Let's just do this for now. On click, we will call the update board function that we have passed in, and we will pass in the column index. Yeah, the column index we are receiving. Okay. We actually have to receive this as props as well over here. That's something we did not do. Okay, so now let's get onto this error. So the issue is I haven't saved gameboard.tsx. Okay, so another thing we need to do is actually check if all the columns are filled. So all the columns with the column index here that is being passed in, if they're all full, then if they're all filled, then the player needs to go again. So we can't switch the player if the columns are filled, because that means he didn't have his turn. So yeah, so we need to make a new variable. We'll call it let our columns filled, and this is going to be a boolean, so it's either true or false, and we'll set it to true. And then if we find a column that is null, so basically over here, then we'll set it to false. So our columns filled, we'll set that to false. And then after we set the board, we want to check if our columns filled. So if it's true, then if it's not true, sorry, so if not our columns filled, so if it's false, then we'll switch the players. So set current player. So yeah, so if it's not filled, then we'll change the player. If it isn't, then the player is going to stay the same here, and he has to go again. So yeah, so set current player. We'll set it to. So we need to check if current player is equal to 1 question mark. So if he's equal to 1, then it will be 2. Otherwise, it will be 1. So save that, and now let's actually test this thing out. So let's refresh. I don't really need to. So if we click here, boom, red, and then yellow, red, yellow. So just in case you didn't understand what I just did with the our columns filled thing, I'll explain it right now. So for example, over here, all the columns are filled over here, right? And I click here, then it would switch the players, but I haven't took my turn. So we want to keep it on the same player, so it should be red. There we go. Otherwise, it would have switched back to yellow, and then yellow would have 2 turns, and that would not be fair. So I hope that makes sense now. Okay. So now everything is set up, and we can actually play the game, but we need to check if someone has won yet. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to check. I'm going to have a function for checking horizontally, and a function for checking vertically, and a function for checking diagonal left, and a function for checking diagonal right. So let's go ahead and implement this. Okay, so I'm going to make a new function. I'll call this check when. Let me close this terminal. Okay, so const check when. Sorry, arrow function. And this will return a boolean. So it's going to return if he won or not. If he won, it's going to be true. If it's not, it's going to be false. So check when is going to return a boolean, and it will receive the index of the row. So so if someone played there right now, we'll take the index of the row he played in and the index of the column he played in. So I'm going to take the exact spot where he played. So the row index is going to be a number, and the column index is also going to be a number. So column index. Okay, and so it's just going to return the check horizontal function that I will be creating right now. Horizontal, and this will also take in the row index and the column index. Let's make this function. So const check horizontal to an arrow function which receives the row index, number, column index, also a number, returns a boolean as well, so either true or false. Function. Okay. So right now we have an error because we're not returning anything. That function is declared type is neither void nor any, must return a value. So we are not returning anything, that's why it's giving us an error. So yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and do this. So before I actually create this check horizontal function, first I want to call the let's call this winCheck, actually makes more sense. Yes, first I want to call this winCheck function inside the update board. So we're going to need the row index because that's what we're expecting in the arguments of this function. And how do we get that? We will make a new variable over here, we'll call it row index. It's going to be a number, and we will set this to 0. And yeah, so if we find the column, then that means it's in the I row, so the index is going to be I. So we'll just set row index to I basically. So that's the row that we have updated. Yeah, and then we will have an if statement. So if winCheck row index column index, sorry, not dot comma, column index. So if it returns true, that means the person has won. Then we're just going to set the board back to the initial board. We're going to reset the board, and we will just alert that current player has won. So current player, we'll say player. I have a string here. Player, and then a space. So player, and then the number of the player. So player 1. Player 2 plus wins, so space wins. Okay, and then another thing we want to do is set the current player back to 1, so we'll reset it, and yeah, that should be it. Okay, so now let's actually do the check horizontal. So how we're going to do this is we will find the row with this row index. So let's do that first. Let row is equal to board dot rows row index. So now I have the row. This is going to be type row. So do that. So before I actually implement this function and create this algorithm for checking if he has won horizontally, I would like to explain this on the board first so it makes more sense before I actually code it. So I just did this first step, finding the row, and I'll show you why. So if we go to the never mind this error. Yeah, so as you can see on the board, let's say we chose this one, right? And so we found the row of this column that we've just picked. So we have the row. Now I'm just going to check each column in this row, and each time I find a consecutive column which has the same player, then I will have a counter, and then if it gets to 4, that means he won. If it doesn't, then he hasn't won yet. So I hope this makes sense. I'm not that good at explaining stuff, so I'm going to go back to the code and it should make sense after I code it. Okay, so we have the row, and like I said, I'm going to make a variable for consecutive columns. So we can count how many columns there are that are consecutive. So this is going to be a number, and we'll start off with 0, of course. And we'll have a for loop, and we'll say let I, which is a number, and we'll set this to 0. And as long as I is smaller than the C4 columns, so how many columns there are in connect 4, then also I++, okay, then we will check if the player of the column we are currently in inside this for loop, so row dot columns I, so the row that we have found from the row index. Yeah, so row columns I dot player. So if the player of this column is equal to the player of the column index that we have received, so row is going to be inside the same row, columns, and then the index is going to be column index dot player. So if it's the same player, then we will say consecutive columns plus plus, so we'll add it by 1. And then we want to check if the consecutive columns is bigger than or equal to 4. We can just check if it's 4, it doesn't really make a difference. Yeah, so if it's bigger than or equal to 4, then we'll return true. So that means the person has 1 horizontally. And if it's not equal, if it's not the same player, so else, we will have to reset the consecutive columns and we'll put it back to 0. And then we will, at the end, we'll just return false. So if this for loop doesn't return true, then that means he hasn't won, then we return false. So yeah, I hope this makes sense, and let's actually test if it works right now. So let's go to the game, let's refresh, put it on there, on there, on there, and now, yeah, there we go, player 1 wins, and it should reset the board. Great. So now we need to check vertically, but before I do that, we have this new game button. We want to actually make it work, so let's go do that. So this is just very simple. Just go to the button that we created, and then on click, arrow function, which returns nothing, so void. Yeah, so what we're going to do is just set board back to initial board. So just reset the board. And let's just test it real quick. Need to test everything we do. And there we go, reset the board. So how I'm going to be checking vertically is pretty much the same as how I checked horizontally. So with horizontal, remember, we found the row and then we just checked each column inside that row. In this case, we have the column and we're just going to check each row in that column. So let's say we clicked here, right? We have the column index, and then we're just going to go up by a row and we'll check the same index. So we'll check here the same column index. So we're going to check each column in we're going to check the same column, sorry, in each row, and then we'll count the consecutive ones. Okay, so let's actually do this now. So we're going to need a new function, const check vertical, and this is going to be an arrow function, receives also row index, and that's going to be a number, and we'll receive the column index, which is also going to be a number, and it also returns a boolean. And yeah, and let's call this inside when check. So we're going to return check horizontal, so that returns true or false, or check vertical. So if any of them are true, then it will turn true. So row index, column index. So if check horizontal is false but check vertical is true, then the when check is going to return true, and that means the person won. If they're both false, then it's going to return false anyways. But if any one of them are true, so we're also going to have or check diagonal right, check diagonal left. If any of those are true, then it returns true. So yeah, so let's actually check if he has won vertically. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find the row. So let's row, it's going to be type row, is equal to board dot rows row index, and then we will have a variable called consecutive columns. We'll set this, oh, this is going to be a number, and we'll set it to 0. And now we'll have a for loop as well. Let I, which is number, set it to 0. I is smaller than the C4 rows this time, because we're going to be looping over the rows, not the columns. And then I plus plus, and yeah. Okay, so now we want to check if the board dot rows, the current row we're on inside this for loop, so the index dot columns, and then we have the column index, and then we'll get the player of this column. If it's equal to the row dot columns, so the row we just found over here, this row, so this is the row of the column index, the tie with the column that the person just played. So yeah, so row dot columns, column index dot player. So if they have the same player, then we're going to do the same as last time. We'll just do consecutive columns plus plus, and we'll check if the consecutive columns is bigger than or equal to 4, then we will return true. So that means he has 1. So true, not 4. Yeah, okay. And then also, if it's not equal, if it's not the same player, then so else, then we just reset the consecutive columns to 0. Okay. And then we just return false at the end as well. So if it hasn't returned true, then that means he hasn't won yet. And let's test this out. So I think everything should be good here. Let's refresh. And so now if I click this, it should win. Yeah, player 1 wins, and there we go, reset. So all that's left is checking diagonal right and checking diagonal left, and this is where it gets tricky. Okay, so I'm going to start off by checking the diagonal right. So it's going to be quite hard to explain, but I'll try my best, and you should understand it by the end of this video. Okay, so I'm going to think of the rows as y, and then the columns as x, and this is going to be basically over here. Actually, we're going to start from here. So this is going to be 0, 0. So for example, over here, this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is going to be 6, and then for columns, this is going to be number 1. Or actually, programmatically, this is going to be 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this is going to be 0 as well. So the y is 5, and then the x is 0 because we're starting off from here for y. So yeah, so let's reset this. Okay, so let's say I chose here, and then we're gonna see which one, so the x or the y, which one can go to 0 quicker. So over here, the y is 5 and the x is 4. So 4 is easy. Sorry, the x is 3 actually. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So 3 is easier to take back to 0 than 5. It only takes 3 steps, and then the y takes 5. So yeah. So we're going to take the x down by 3, and then the y is going to also go down by 3. So it's going to be so the x is going to be 3 minus 3 is 0. So the x is going to be 0, and then the y is going to be 5 minus 3. So it's going to be 2, which is going to take us back to here. So once we are here, then we're just going to up the row by 1 and up the column by 1. So we're going to check this, and then up the row by 1, and we'll have a for loop that does that, and that way we'll check the diagonal right. So I hope this makes sense. It's kind of hard to explain. So essentially, I'm just going to take it back to the lowest point I could. So I'm going to try and make either x or y 0, and then from there I'll just add up the row by 1 and the column by 1 until we're at the end of the board. It should make sense after I actually code this out though. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to have a new function. So const check diagonal right, and it's going to be an arrow function, takes in the row index as well, number, and column index, number, and it's going to also return a boolean. Okay, so we'll start off by saying that the consecutive columns, which is a number, is 0. We're also going to be counting consecutive columns, obviously, and then we want to get the index difference, so the difference between the x and y. So I'll explain this in a bit. So let's index difference, which is a number, is equal to row index minus the column index. So this way we see which one's bigger and by how much it's bigger. So let me go back to the board. So for example, over here basically we have the we said the y is 5 and the x is 3, because remember we start off by 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so the y is 5 and the x is 3. So we're going to be doing y minus x, so 5 minus 3, which is 2, and so 2 means it's positive. So since it's positive, that means the y is bigger, because we're saying y minus x. So if it's positive, that means y is bigger. So if y is bigger, then the x is going to be 0, and the y is going to be what is left, which is 2. So 5 minus 3 is 2. That means y is going to be 2 and x is going to be 0. Because what we're trying to do is make either x or y 0. So yeah. And then let's say that it is we get a minus result. So y is, for example, 3 and x is 5. So it's going to be 3 minus 5, and that's going to be minus 2. So since it's minus, that means that x must be bigger, because y minus x, if it gives us a minus result, then x is bigger than y. So we know x is bigger, that means y is going to be 0, and x is going to be more than 0. And we found out that the difference between them is 2, so x is going to be 2. The difference between them is minus 2, but we'll remove the minus and make it 2. So this is kind of hard to understand, but it should hopefully make sense to you. Okay, and so remember, we're trying to get the row, and we're trying to get the column to start from, where we're going to start checking. So over here we're going to go down to here. So I'm going to get to the column index of this and the row index of this, basically. So let's column to start from, we'll call it, which is a number, set it to 0, and then the row, sorry, not capital R, row to start from, which is a number, is equal to 0. So we're just going to have them as 0 for starters, and then we're going to check if the index difference, so like I said, if it's bigger than 0, so that means it's positive, and we're doing row index, so we're going to say row is y and column is x, so y minus x. If it's positive, so if it's bigger than 0, then that means the y is bigger than x, so x is going to be 0. So we're just going to say the column is x, so column to start from is going to be 0 because y is bigger, and then the row to start from, which is y, is going to be equal to the index difference. So it's going to be equal to the index difference. And well, actually we don't need to say column to start from 0 because we already said that at the start. And then if it's not bigger than 0, so we want to say else if, and we're not doing else, we're doing else if, because it could be 0. If it's 0, then they're both going to be 0. The x is going to be 0 and y is 0. If the difference between the y and x is 0, then it's just going to be 0. So we need to say else if index difference is actually smaller than 0. So if it's a minus number, then we will say then the row to start from is going to be 0, and then the column to start from is going to be equal to the index difference, but we want to remove the minus, so we'll say math dot abs dot absolute index difference. So that just removes the minus for us, and we just get the number. So yeah, so now we have the row to start from, and now we're just going to add we're going to have a for loop that just adds the row by 1 and adds the column by 1 each time until we get to the end of the board. So yeah, and then we'll just count the consecutive columns. So for let I, which is a number, sorry, space here, number, set it to 0, and we're going to be looping over the rows, so C4 rows, and I++. So now we are going to find the column we are currently on inside this for loop. So let column, which is going to be type column, of course, sorry, column, yeah, is equal to, well, first let's actually go back, source slash components slash interfaces slash column. Okay, so we're over here. Okay, so the column is going to be board dot rows, and then the index of the row is going to be the row to start from, so the starting point, plus the index. So remember, we're going to be going we're adding the row by 1 each time, and the column is also dot columns, which is going to be column to start from plus the index. And yeah, so that's the column. And over here we actually have to add a question mark for the rows, because we might get to a row that does not exist, then we'll have an error because then there's no columns. And if we get to a column that doesn't exist, then that should not give us an error, we should be good. So yeah, so over here then we're going to check if the column exists, because maybe the column doesn't exist, like I said. If the column exists, then we want to check if the player, so column dot player is equal to the board dot rows row index, so the column that we just picked, that the player just played, so column index and row index dot player. So if they have the same player, then consecutive columns plus plus, and then we want to check if the consecutive columns is bigger than or equal to 4, then we will return true. And then if the players are not matching, so if it's a different player, then we'll reset the consecutive columns. And I think that's pretty much it. And then at the end we'll just return false. So at the end of this for loop over here, we return false. Let's save this, and we need to call this check diagonal right. So yeah, check diagonal right, row index, column index. Let's save this. I'm going to format this code actually. There we go. Okay, yeah, so now let's actually test this out. So let's refresh. And so it's not going to be right this way. It's going to be right this way. Because we're starting, so let's say we clicked here, remember we're going to go back down here. And then we're going to check right, which is like that. So I hope that makes sense. So yeah, so for example from here. And then, sorry actually. We have an issue here. When we click new game, we need to actually reset the current player as well. So where is this? Set board, initial board. We need to make this into a function. And we also want to say set current player to 1. Save that. Okay. Yeah, so like I said, the right is going to be like that. So actually left from this, if you look at it this way. So yeah, there, and then right there, and a right here, yellow there. So if I click here, then we should have 1. There we go, player 1 wins. Great, so all that's left is checking diagonal left, and I'm going to do this a bit different in a way that's a bit more understandable as well. So okay. So the way I'm going to do this is very similar to checking the right diagonal, but the way I'm going to code it is different. So with the right, remember, so let's say this is where we played. We're going to go back this way to the end of, well, to either make x0 or y0. And now for diagonal left, what I'm going to do is go this way. So I'm going to have a for loop that keeps adding the rows by 1. So if it adds the row by 1, then we're going to be here. And then minus it, sorry, minus is the row by 1, because remember this is the starting point for the rows. So minus the row by 1 will be here, and then add the column by 1 will be here, and then we'll keep doing that and until we get to the end of the board, until like there's no more column, until, so if for example over here, right, we minus the row by 1 will be here, and then add the column by 1 will be here, and that doesn't exist. So this would be our starting point for the check diagonal left, and then from here we'll just keep going down just like we did for the check diagonal right. So yeah, instead of just minusing the x and y, I'm actually going to have a for loop that gets to the end of the board. So I hope it makes sense. Let's actually get started. So we'll make a new function, check diagonal left, and also our function that takes in row index, which is a number, and the column index, which is also a number. And this also returns a boolean, so either true or false. Let's call this. So check diagonal left, row index, column index. Okay. So we're going to have the consecutive columns as well. So let consecutive columns number is equal to 0, and then we're also going to have the column to start from. A number, so it's the index of the column to start from, that's why it's a number. We're going to set it to row index, and then we'll have the row to start from, which is a number, and we will set this to the column index, So we're going to be starting off from here, and then remember we're going to go up, go minus a row, and then add a column, minus a row, add a column, like I said. So we'll have a for loop, and we'll say let I, which is a number, set that to 0. Yeah, and then we'll say I is smaller than C4 rows, I plus plus, and then we will find the column. So let column, just type column, and it's equal to board dot rows. Now remember I said we're going to get the row index, so the current place where we just played, and we will minus it by I, and then we will get the columns of that row, and we'll get the column index and plus I. So remember I said we're going to minus the rows and plus the columns until we get to the end of the board, and then from there we'll check the diagonal left all the way down to the end of the board as well. So yeah, okay, and also we also need a question mark here, because what if we get to a place that doesn't exist on the board, then we'll have an error because that doesn't have any columns because it doesn't exist. And then we also need to check if the column exists, because then the row might exist but the column doesn't exist, because we are adding the column by I each time, so it might not exist. Okay, yeah, so if column, then we'll set the column to start from is equal to column index plus I. Sorry, not equals, plus I. Plus I. And then the row to start from is equal to row index plus I. So basically we're getting to the end of the board on the right side of the board, and then from there we'll just go down left. I hope this makes sense because it's quite confusing. And yeah, so if the column exists, then we'll do that. Otherwise there's no point. If the column doesn't exist, that means we are at the end of the board already, so we'll just break because there's no point to keep going with this for loop. So yeah, okay, now we know where to start from. Now we need to have a for loop that is similar to the check diagonal right for loop, and it's pretty much the same thing, so we can copy it. Well, I'm going to explain it so you understand it better. I'm just going to do it again. So for let j, because we already have a variable called I, number is equal to 0, j is smaller than the C4 rows, so we'll connect 4 rows, j plus plus. So we'll get the column. Let's type column is equal to board dot rows, and now we are going to get the row to start from plus, not minus this time, and I'll explain why in a second, plus j, and then the column to start from minus j. So why we are adding the rows now and minusing the columns is, let me get to the board actually so it makes more sense. So if I refresh, or I don't need to, yeah, so if I click here, right, and so the first for loop takes us to here, we find the starting point, and from here we want to go down left. So how do we do that? We're going to add the rows, because remember we start off from here with the rows 1, 2, 3. So we are here, we want to add the rows by 1, so we come down here. So once we add the rows we come down here, and then we want to minus the columns by 1, so we go here, because the columns start from here, so 1, 2, 3. So we minus the columns by 1, and then we go here, and then this is in the diagonal line of this column, and we keep doing that until we get to the end of the board. So yeah, so now we have the column. Now I need to check if this column exists, and yeah, we also need a question mark here just to check if the row exists, because it might not exist and then we'll get an error like I said. So if the column exists, then we will check if the column dot player is equal to the board dot rows row index. So the column that we played of the current player, column index dot player. Then we will do consecutive columns plus plus, like I said last time. If the consecutive columns is bigger than or equal to 4, then we we will just return true. And if not, so if the player is different, then we'll reset the consecutive columns to 0. And at the end of this function, at the end of this for loop, sorry, after it, when we're done, we will just return false. So that means if the for loop didn't return true, then we need to return false, because that means he hasn't won. So, oh, we already pulled it. Okay, great. So now let's test this out. So like I said, it's going to be this way, because we're going to be resetting it and then checking diagonally left from here, not diagonally left from, so let's say we played here, we're not going to be checking diagonally left from here, no, we're going to reset it and then check diagonally left from here. So if we want, it should be like this, and then, sorry about that, I should have not done that, and there we go, here, it works. So the last thing we need to do is actually check for a draw, so let's do this. So yeah, the way I'm going to check for a draw is, first I will check if he hasn't won, then we'll just check if the board is filled, that means he's drawed, because that means there's a draw. Because he hasn't won and the board is filled, so there's definitely a draw. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's make a new function, we'll call it draw check. And this is an arrow function, which takes nothing, but it returns a boolean, so it either returns true or false. And so first let's actually call this, so if win check, so we're checking if he's won, otherwise then we'll else if, so else if draw check, so if he hasn't won then we'll check for a draw. Yeah, okay, so if he hasn't won we'll check for a draw, and if he has drawed then we'll reset the board to initial board, and we'll alert draw, and we'll set the current player back to 1, and yeah, so now let's check for draw. So the way we are going to do this is we'll have a variable called is board filled, and this is just going to be a boolean, and we'll return is board filled, just so we get rid of this error, the one over here. So if so what's this going to be? It's going to be we're going to filter the rows, so board, we're going to filter the rows with the rows that have empty columns. So if there is rows with empty columns, then that means the board is not filled. So yeah, so board.rows.filter, and then this will give us a row, then we will filter the columns of this row, so row.columns.filter, and we will receive a column which is type column, obviously, and then we will say we will check if the column.player is null or not, so just say column.player is equal to null, so this will just return true or false. So if it's true, then it will it's going to filter based on if the answer of this question is true or false. So if it's equal to null or not, then it will filter it based on that. So yeah, so just like we are checking if we are testing the column.player if it's null or not, we're going to be testing the row as well. So based on the length of the columns array that it contains, so if it's bigger than 0 or not, that's how we're going to filter it based on that. And then okay, and then if there are any rows left, so dot length is bigger than 0. So if there are any rows with an empty column, right, then that means the board is not filled. So we'll have a question mark. If the length is bigger than 0 of this array, that means the board is still not filled, and so is board filled would basically be false, and otherwise it will be true. And let's format this and save this, and yeah, I think we should be good now. So I hope this makes sense, and let's refresh. Now let's try and fill this up and see what we get, and obviously try and not make this a win. which I do not know how I'm going to do now. Okay. Oh, okay, so I have a yellow here, then a red, yellow, red, and then we can have whatever here. Yes, it says draw. Great. So I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.